Video games that feature violence are often fun and widely enjoyed around the world, and for good reason. Many of the best games ever made would not exist without it. Probably everyone has played a violent game before, just like everybody has consumed books, series or movies that feature violence. And this is totally fine, as violence is an inherent part of life and deserves and needs to be portrayed in art. We all know how shooters and RPGs are supposed to work, that the hero's journey is supposed to feature all kinds of obstacles that they have to overcome, and most often the use of violence is the way to go. But especially in the early shaping ages, video games were mainly enjoyed and made by a male audience, and this supposedly has led to many different issues in recent years for women and underrepresented groups. So maybe, just maybe, it is only fun for a specific target group? What if there is something out there that aims for a different solution in common video games genres? Let me tell you about the value of non-violent video games. The history of violence in video games has a great legacy. Yet the very first video game, Tennis for Two, was a non-violent video game. Followed by Space War, which was not. Followed by Computer Space, which was not. You see where this is going. Violence is an inherent part of video game culture, and we owe many great games and innovations to the use of violence in games. Victory over opponents is fun. Beating up your worst enemy is fun. Destroying things is fun. Shooting is fun. And for some, even killing is fun. Humans just like to dominate and destroy. But video games have grown and established themselves as a major art form. They already started to question the status quo. The recent boom of the indie game market proves there is a different path. The sheer amount of innovation indie games gifted to us just in a couple of years is the first indicator to this. We even see more and more indie games that completely forgo violence. And we can also see this innovation influencing the big games like double and triple A games. It seems there is a growing demand for unconventional games. Video essayist Chris Franklin from the channel Errant Signal argues that one of the biggest underlying reasons for the amount of violence in video games is the way computers work, how they handle human input and process data. While computers cannot handle things like emotions, creativity or social code, they excel at formal rules and are able to handle huge amounts of data. Putting it another way, while a Dungeons and Dragons game won by humans can have deep and satisfying social encounters, handling big amounts of data and keeping track of many things is nearly impossible for humans. For the computers, it's the other way around. The other area where computers excel, and this is the core argument of Franklin, is the simulation of space. This means simulating movement in a digital environment. Also, it is supposedly easy to develop input devices meant to control movement in these spatial simulations. Designing input devices with satisfying experience for shooting is far superior than creating ones for deep emotional conversations. Can you imagine how an emotion controller is supposed to look like? Yeah, me neither. And that's why our most popular games are about spatial simulations. In the overwhelming majority of games, you move your little character around. And while other reasons for the popularity of violence in video games are also true, Franklin states the main reason is as follows. Violence isn't chosen because developers necessarily want to make violent content. It's that violent content is the path of least resistance from every angle, technologically, aesthetically, and financially. Yet, this ain't no unsolvable problem. It's a challenge. Let's take a step back and see what humans enjoy in the first place. I believe what is needed to portray an immersive experience in general is struggle. Struggle ought to be the very concept of life. It's what makes the experience or representation of life interesting. And as chance would have it, violence is a very easy and effective way to express struggle. The struggle to survive through combat is maybe the most easy to understand. Shooters don't need the story to be fun. The metaphor is so essential to life that everybody understands it. You need to survive at all cost. It's them or us. But the range of human emotion and struggles is so much broader than just physical survival against enemies. The human desire of belonging, recognition, fulfillment, self-improvement, or the incredible broad range of emotion and social interactions, of fear and love, they offer so much more content, meaningful and important content. But making games is rather difficult, because making art is difficult. Thus, for reason mentioned, the depiction of more complex human struggles is harder, much harder. And that is why violence is portrayed so exorbitantly often. To say it in the words of yet another great video essayist, by building games around sources of struggle that don't involve a need to beat your enemies, it allows us to create experiences that feel completely different to engage with. And this way, we can create experiences that represent more complex ranges of human emotions. But to understand how we can achieve such endeavor, we must know what violence is in the first place. The word violence stems from the Old French word violence and already contained the meaning of physical force to inflict injury or damage. And this French word was allegedly a combination derived from three Latin words: violentia, violentus, and violare. So, in the most general sense, violence is some kind of force that someone or something is expending. The philosopher Vittorio Bufacci noted that often in today's usage, the word violence contains not only the meaning of vehemence as passionate and uncontrolled force, but is often conflated with the word violation, meaning infringement. Because violence is often accompanied by a violation of norms, rights, and rules. But he mentions that this combination of violence and violation is not desirable to get a satisfactory definition of what violence is. He correctly notes that there are times when violence occurs without the need of any physical force, or alternatively, acts of physical force may take place without anything or anyone being violated. What does he mean by that? A law can be violated without the use of any force. If I willingly don't pay my taxes, I am violating law, but I do not violently harm somebody. At least not directly. I may harm the institution of the state, or harm the general public by not doing my part. But this is way too indirect to be understood as an act of violence, in my opinion. Same goes with physical force that targets no one. Water waves, for example, can have devastating powers. You can see gigantic waves on the open sea with enormous implied power, but when they only crash into the ocean, no one was harmed, hence the water cannot be harmed. So we have two basic definitions. First, violence of force as an act of force, and secondly, violence of violation as an act of transgression against the concept of rights of living beings. These definitions are still not satisfying enough. We need to add something to the definition to pierce deeper into the meaning of violence. So let's take a look at some kinds of violence. The first thing we can notice is that all these definitions contain either some form of force or harm, which basically are the boiled down and simplified meanings of violence and violation. So we cannot define non-violence in this context as simply the logical opposition to an action of doing harm or force. We cannot simply say it's an action with the absence of violence. So the second thing we can notice is the part of willingness. Either you harm unwillingly, then in most cases it is either an accident or any kind of lacking commitment, duty or care, or it is willingly, then it is in most cases a violation of rights. Taking responsibility is a vital part of not doing any harm. Though you might be responsible for causing harm, you might not always have had the intention to do so. Because if you did have had the intention and were responsible for it, you were acting violently, without a doubt. But if you hadn't had the intention, even if you were responsible, you were acting non-violently, even if the outcome might have been violent. This might be a little bit confusing, so let me give you an example. If I would be stepping on your feet without the intention to cause you any harm, it would still be my fault, yet I wasn't acting violently. But if I really hate you and step on your foot with intention, then I would be acting violently. But as you can see, non-violent actions can still lead to harm. So for now I will define non-violence as an action with the intention of not doing harm. To see now how we can apply these definitions to video games, we have to set it in a context and examine how violence and non-violence are used in games. For this to make sense, it is important to understand what a game mechanic really is. I do not mean the mere definition, but what the very core of them is. Yet, I will give you but a quick definition without big rambling. If you still want to have an in-depth exploration of this definition, please see my thesis at the end of the video. To put it simple, a game mechanic is a rule or a process that, in interaction with players, can have dynamics. A rule or a process itself do not inherently contain ethical value, but the application of this rule does. More correctly, the application of the rule plus the intention. The context of where, on what, and how people apply rules or processes determine if something is good or bad, violent or non-violent. Not the rule itself. The rule is just a tool. And by deciding how to use a tool, we decide if our actions are good or bad. But this is all very abstract, so let me give you a quick example. If we, for example, say a rule states hold tight, what comes to mind? I'd say not much. But if we add context or a metaphor to a rule, that will change. Now we say hold tight onto this flower. What comes to mind? Seems lovely at first, but did we pick the flower and thus end its life? Or maybe we are forced to hold on a thorny rose? Is that violence then? Or maybe there's no real flower at all, but a plastic one and no living being was harmed. Point being, The rule itself never changed. It always had the same execution, always the same button press, but was it always the same action? Of course not. And this has major implication on game mechanics. The metaphor mattered, the context mattered, but wait a minute. Does this mean a game mechanic cannot be inherently violent? Which in turn means there are no non-violent game mechanics? Well, I have to admit this contradiction, but only for a lack of better term, because non-intentional use of violence implying game mechanic sounds not so catchy. But back to the topic. Non-violence is an action with the intention of not doing harm, and a game mechanic is a rule or a process that in interaction with players can create dynamics. So we can finally define non-violent game mechanics as rules or processes that in combination with the metaphor makes the player intentionally choose not to do harm. And to design a non-violent game is to give it a metaphor with the intention to make players conscious about their violent actions and their consequences. Great games make the players question their own behaviors. For example, by tricking them into thinking they made use of their own free will, while in reality the game was deciding. Games like BioShock that trick players into obeying orders while thinking they were free to choose. Or Spec Ops The Line that made it look like you were doing the good thing as the righteous soldier fighting terrorism, just to unveil that at war everybody is losing. Or more recently, Disco Elysium, which makes you question everything really. Like, what the hell is this game? But honestly, Disco Elysium confronts players with themselves on an unprecedented level. Not just through the narrative, but through its mechanics. Now, arguably, none of these games are completely free of violence, but that's not the point here. I see these games as innovative merely because they dare to go on a different route and question the status quo of their time and genre. All of these examples masterfully and brutally make players come to realize that they have been tricked or, au contraire, played with. And this realization immediately makes players reflect upon their own actions. This is immensely powerful, because they don't just question their own actions as a player, but as a private person. So, non-violent game design is able to make players become aware of their own actions and make them the agents of their own decisions. How is this possible? By offering tools to the players that make them intentionally want not to choose violence. And this is the core of non-violent game design. Exploring anti-violence or non-violent game mechanics in genres that typically lack them naturally, like puzzles or sport games, is good, but boring. It only really gets interesting in games genres that typically portray a lot of violence and even live by it. A non-violent chess game? Who cares? A non-violent shooter? A non-violent RPG? Ooh, that's interesting. Yet, you still might ask, why care at all? I like my games with actions. Why would I pay attention to all of this? So, let me give you two major reasons. First of all, it's a huge chance for the art form video games as a whole to mature and grow into directions never explored. The potential innovations that might be unveiled by not taking the way of least resistance, and think about how to make a typically violent game non-violent, is immense. And secondly, it's a huge chance for you, the player, The same games with the same player pleasures attract the same players and keep them locked inside their bubble by exploring new game ideas, new or underrepresented player experience, emotions, and pleasures spring into existence. This will give players truly new alternatives to the status quo, and will lead to more and new players enjoying the medium, and ultimately leads to more diversity in games and player base. To not opt into violence because the genre demands it, and by offering alternatives to common games, we offer a choice and representation for people. Or to word it correctly, by designing non-violent game mechanics, we will achieve new and innovative ways of diverse representation of player pleasures. If you want to go deeper into this topic and see some examples of non-violent game design, please see my thesis. You can find it in the description. Thank you very much for taking your time watching this video. What do you think about the potential of non-violence in games? Tell me in the comments.